as debt goes. I think because the New Testament does use the language of debt, and the argument that I made in the debate is that what debt fundamentally refers to is the separation that we have with respect to God. And the way to parse this out is to think about the way in which the language of God's uncreated glory is expressed in the New Testament. This is a point that St. Seraphim of Sarov makes and is on the acquisition of the Holy Spirit of God. And this is what actually started me thinking through the implications of this language from Old to New Testament. St. Seraphim says that the grace of the Holy Spirit is often symbolized or signified in financial terms. So we see in the parables of Jesus, Jesus says trade till I come. Jesus will use the imagery of an investment appreciating value to describe one's appropriation of the grace of the Holy Spirit. In the book of Revelation, Jesus says, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire. In the temple, you have a series of metals which increase in value as you proceed inwards to the most holy place, because in the most holy place, that is where God's uncreated life directly dwells, and that is signified by the most valuable metal. The way to see this most directly is to look at the language that Paul uses, the riches of God's glory. He will use this language multiple times throughout his epistles. So the riches of divine glory is the way in which the imagery of God's uncreated life is signified in financial terms. And what a debt is, when you get down to brass tacks, when you look at the inner nature of the concept, what is a debt? A debt is a gap between what one owes, what one ought to be, financially speaking, and what one actually is able to pay. So one has a disposition or a relation to God. And since the fall, there is a rupture between what we ought to be and what we actually are. And because God is infinite and because we are finite, any rupture, no matter how slight, can be signified in the language of an infinite debt. So we have to be careful about what this actually means. This is using a very specific and precise symbolic grammar, but that's the way that I understand the language of debt in both Old and New Testaments. So how is it that we can be restored to right standing with God in the New Testament? Well, Christ is the eternal Son. And so he, by his very nature, is eternally radiant with divine glory. He has the key to the full treasury. So we see in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, the language of grace is expressed using the language of rain from heaven. Isaiah picks up this language from Deuteronomy 11 and elsewhere to talk about how God's grace will transfigure the world so that no longer will thorns and briars sprout up, but rather myrtle trees, and the world will be transfigured
into.
Of
the doctrine like dew and water dripping. I think it's Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah, yeah.
Brings forth life. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. The language of rain from heaven refers to God's enlivening grace. But in Deuteronomy, this is called a treasury. So God opens his good treasury and sends forth his grace on the earth, which recreates it, which enables Israel to bring forth a great harvest, which is then captured in the language of wealth. So
you're saying that's the treasury of merits that we tap into. I'm joking. The treasury merits at the same. I'm just joking.
After a fashion, you can use. We always have to be careful about the language that we use, in part because every phrase after 2,000 years of church history now has a history, and that history isn't always an orthodox one. So that's why some of the fathers,
right? Yeah, that argument is used by Roman Catholic apologists. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that they'll read into that, right? That extended. Oh, and so therefore you see that there's a treasury of the merits that we can pull from.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead.
And so Christ, being eternally radiant with divine glory, has an infinite valuation of riches, and being joined to the human family, he enables the human family to tap into that infinite valuation, and he communicates it to us, which means ontologically that the life of the Holy Spirit is communicated to us through our union with Christ. So we have the riches of divine glory, which means actual participation in God's life. And that makes up the separation between man and God, which ontologically is death, financially, symbolically, is expressed in the language of debt. And I think the way to parse this out in New Testament terminology is to look at the way that Paul talks about our justification. For example, Galatians. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faithfulness of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Then Galatians 5:6, Paul says it is neither circumcision or uncircumcision, which means anything, but rather faith working or energizing, energe is the word used, energizing through love. And so faith working through love is significant for our justification because that is the life of Christ, which is dwelling in us, which is communicated to us through the Holy Spirit. And he will then say in 1 Corinthians 15:10 that it is not I, but the grace of God, which is with me. Those are the works which are significant for justification. And I made a couple of videos over the past few days about what works of the Torah means. And what I argued is that works of the Torah does not mean those works which are prescribed in the Torah. Rather, works of the Torah refers to what the Torah actually does. So the Torah is the agent here. So what does the Torah do in relation to a person who is in the flesh? Well, Paul says in Romans 7 and elsewhere that what the Torah does is it stirs up the flesh and thus brings forth fruit for death. And so the contrast to the works of the Torah is the faithfulness of Christ living and communicated in and to us, so that it is the works of Christ, the works of the Spirit, which enable us to bring forth fruit for God, rather than what the Torah brings forth in us, which is to bring forth fruit for death.